Hi, Gary. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Linda. Thank you.
And now, so Gary, you are a practicing therapist working in Belfast, Northern
Yeah,
Ireland for the past 2 years.
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Wonderful. And you were just starting to tell me about, the background and how you came to get into this field. And I interrupted you. I
Mm.
said, wait, let me record. So, so if you want to tell me about yourself for the people that don't know you, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, psychotherapy. What I'm doing now has been a second career for me, really. Having worked in the police in Northern Ireland for 24 years. 17 of those years, I specialised in search work. A lot of that was involving missing persons, vulnerable people, a lot of people with very serious mental health issues. Many of them were suicidal. And much of that work, unfortunately, was at the extreme end of that. Locating people who had committed suicide and recovery of remains, dealing with families. So, I've got to see really the very sort of extreme end of where mental health issues can take others. And, ultimately, could very easily have taken me too, because, my career ended somewhat early through being medically retired because of PTSD, result of the work that I'd done. So yeah, I mean, having worked in that world, I have a bit of a perspective on mental health, and seeing a lot of people, it felt to me like they were dropping through the gaps in the system. A lot of people were crying out for help and really weren't getting support. Um, and I felt that I was, having seen what I had seen, that I was coming with a certain perspective, but also bringing a lot of my own personal history and my own personal trauma into that work, where, um, I wasn't coming from a place of having just read something from a book. I've experienced trauma in my own life. Like many of us, I think, like many therapists, that idea of the wounded healer. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a little bit of my background.
You're totally right. I think a lot of us do get into this field because of our own trauma, our own experience, because of
Mm,
course then we recognize it, right? It's a little
yeah,
bit easier to get into.
absolutely.
But
Yeah.
24 years doing
Yeah.
doing that kind of work, and then for a lot of people, I mean, that's incredible that you were able to go into the mental health realm rather than sort of running and screaming from the whole field altogether.
Yeah. I mean, whilst there's a connection, um, they're still very different. Um, you, for a large part of that time, I was a dog handler working within specialist search. So, I had well, at one point I had three working dogs, and that was recovery dogs, which are trained to search for human remains, and an explosives dog, so searching for bombs. Um, and there would have been a very easy way for this kind of work in the civilian world afterwards, but because of the nature of how I retired, I needed to separate. I needed to separate from any connection really with the police for my own well-being. There was too much association there for me, and so I had started to do some courses, actually while I was still working, purely out of interest, and really, I suppose, to find out a little bit more about myself. Um, so I had started doing some night courses while I was still working, and never with a plan, never with an intention to become a therapist, and it really just developed quite organically as a result of that.
Mhm. Wow. So how do you find working in this kind of field now in comparison to what you used to do?
Yeah, it's very different. It's very different to some parts of it, and yet very similar to other parts. Um, as a dog handler in the couple of different disciplines that I worked in. So one of my dogs, the victim recovery dog, um, that dog was trained to search for drowned victims. So that would involve being on a boat with the dog, searching bodies of water. Um, and that was, there's a lot of uncertainty with that type of work, and there's a lot of see the result because you're looking for something that is in the water, underneath the water, using the dog's nose as the indicator, and you have to rely then on divers going into the water to search what they're being given. So there's a lot of uncertainty in that, and in some ways, it's a bit like being a therapist, where you're sitting in the room sometimes with the client, and you don't really know, is this right? Is this happening? Is the person benefiting from what we're doing? There's a level of uncertainty in all of that, I think. And actually, one of my tutors, as I was training, used to say that all the time. Therapy is just two anxious people in a room together. Um, yeah, and so there's some stuff around that that's similar, and then the flip side of that is that my other work with explosive search was very definite, and there were very, very clear boundaries and guidelines around that, and that was a very set thing. And I kind of reached a level in my career where I was certainly with the victim recovery stuff, I was taking part in review cases on a UK wide basis, sort of really as a UK subject matter expert in that. And I kind of gone as far as I could go, and was, knew as much as I could know in relation to that field, and then having to start again completely, and really come into this world as a total beginner, and learn from scratch, has been really interesting. But like, I love that. I love the idea of the beginner's mind, of approaching things from that perspective of, look, I'm here to learn. This is because you know a lot of this is a bit self-indulgent, because I'm still learning about myself. Every day I'm thinking, okay, well, what's going to come up today? What am I going to learn today? And every piece of training that I do, every book that I read, every piece of CPD that I do, I'm thinking, okay, well, what am I going to know about myself out of this? So yeah, it's a really interesting kind of place to be.
Absolutely. And just to put this out there, we're always learning. It never ends, the learning. It's,
Mm,
and then we're constantly
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
adding it into this big pot of things that we know, and we can kind of take from them as we need. So
yeah,
hopefully making us better, more well-adjusted people.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you were medically retired because of PTSD.
Mm,
And
mm,
can I ask a little bit about what you noticed sort of leading up to, that's it, I've got to get out?
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Um, I mean, I was first diagnosed with PTSD in 2001. Like, I spent a year doing a very, uh, very, very stressful piece of work with something that was going on in Belfast at that time, working under a really intense terrorist threat against police for really kind of a 12 or 13-month period. Um, and during that time, we were shot at. Our vehicles were blown up. Um, colleagues were shot, colleagues were injured. There was a lot happening at that time. I was drinking very heavily at that time, drinking alcoholically essentially at that time as a means of self-medicating, and my life was falling apart really. And I went to see a psychiatrist actually, who I didn't realize, but he had been an ex-police officer himself, and I didn't realize that when I went. But so I spent about 6 months working with him, and he diagnosed me as having PTSD, which all made sense given where I had been working. But the interesting thing is that, I was heavily self-medicating through alcohol, and yet my attitude at that time was, you're the expert. If this is a problem, you'll find out. So I had a bit of an arrogance about that, and I think I wasn't also ready to look at that as an issue for myself. So that was one of the stepping stones, I would say, in a series of stepping stones that happened. But really how it displayed itself at that time was through alcohol, and through really I just wasn't there. When I was at home, I wasn't there. I just wasn't present. I was at work all of the time, whether I was at work or not physically.
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't imagine just the chronic stress and pressure and fear that just piles up. And of course, now we've mentioned as well in our first conversation that there's a different pressure for men.
Yeah. Yeah, I think men have a perception perhaps of what they should be and how they should deal with these things. One of the first traumatic incidents that I dealt with in the police was in 1996, and I was first on the scene at the scene of a murder, a shooting, and the victim was apparently he was a terrorist. I knew him; he was a terrorist, and this man was responsible for murdering a number of people, and he had been murdered himself. And I was first on the scene, and after that, I had nightmares. My sleep was very, very disturbed. Kind of flashbacks from the scene, but I couldn't balance this up because one side of me, one part of me thought, well, this man's a terrorist. He's an evil man. The world is a better place without him. And I shouldn't be affected by this. I know this man's a murderer. I shouldn't be affected by this. Yet the other side of me, the human part, had seen something, really a very unnatural and horrible thing, had seen someone lose their life, had seen someone murdered, and was at a human level very impacted by that. And I couldn't balance these two things out. I couldn't understand why I was affected by this, because the kind of, whether it was the man side of me and the perception of that I had, or as a police officer, or maybe both. I should have thought about it as well, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword type of attitude. But yet, that's not how my body was reacting to this. My body was saying, this is not right. This is not good. This is traumatic. And so that kind of war with myself, I've come to see, is not a healthy place to be for human beings, where we are in this tension of, fighting against ourselves in terms of the self-imposed ideas that we put on ourselves. You shouldn't do, or, you should do, or, you should be able to. And it just it just creates such pain and turmoil. Whenever I I've recently done some training in IFS and internal family systems, and when Dexter talks about the different parts, I mean, it was very clear to me that I had very clear parts within that story. So I had.
Mm-hmm. The conflicting parts, it's such an interesting line
Mm,
of work when you're able to work therapeutically and addressing, here's this part of you that is insisting on thinking this way, and here's this part, and they're completely at odds. So
mm,
I've only just started to explore IFS, but I have a
yeah,
colleague that is a big fan of it. So really
yeah.
interesting work to be done there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I am also just beginning to sort of look into it, but it does sit very well for me, because I can certainly see how there has been, these conflicting voices within me for much of my life, really. And I also think that's the case. I see that with clients that I work with as well. I see that certainly with men and women. This is not unique to men, certainly, but and it's interesting. I've watched some of your other interviews with some of your other folks on here, and they've been great. And the idea, yeah, and the impact of social media on people and that kind of fear of missing out type thing. And I've worked with men in their mid 40s, late 40s who are looking at Facebook, who are seeing friends posting on Facebook of their ideal lives, and they're saying to me, "I know this is not real, yet I still feel like I'm missing out." So they know on a cognitive level, they know this is not quite the perfect thing that's being presented. Yeah, so it's interesting. It's interesting.
It really is, yeah. And that social media portrayal, of course, is so we just pick and choose what, not only what we want to post, but what we want
Mm.
to see.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So, do you work with a lot of PTSD yourself now in terms of therapy?
Um, it not specifically. Um, it certainly does come up for many people. I'm really interested in, just sort of the area of developmental trauma and complex trauma, because the interesting thing that I've noticed about myself is that, I think my experience of it is, you know, it's reasonably extreme, my experience of trauma, but I have really come to an understanding that it doesn't have to be that for it to be traumatizing at all. And I would be very much sort of against that idea. I would really like to see the whole um, the idea of well, PTSD is only something that happens to soldiers or to police officers or to firefighters. I think that is really harmful, that idea, and keeps many people from really getting effective treatment. Um, and I mean, I know that is shifting somewhat, and I'm really happy to see that. But um, you know, just the idea that so many of us have these traumas in our life from childhood, not because of the things that happened to us necessarily, but because of the things that we didn't get, because of the lack sometimes of real nurturing and emotional connection. Um, I don't know what it was like for you growing up, but certainly for me, and that's it. Certainly, I see it with a lot of my clients who are Irish. Well, growing up, there was an attitude of, well, you have a roof over your head and there's food in the cupboard and you have clothes on your back. That's all you need. You don't need anything else. You certainly don't need any of this emotional, mushy stuff. That'll only make you soft. And that was very pervasive certainly here, and certainly the attitude that I grew up with. So I think not to criticize, our parents and criticize people of that generation. But yeah, so that comes up a lot. That comes up a lot for many of the clients that I work with, certainly that I see.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder sometimes it goes back to, if we think even 100 years ago, we had more ritual around these
Mm,
things that we go through. And we've lost a lot of that, at least as far as I can see. There was a time period where when someone died in your family, there's a whole ritual, a whole routine, the whole family always, they just knew to do. And now
yeah,
it's different. It's changed.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I think the other thing is about modern. I'm going back to modern times again. The kind of the damage is done for children now. Of course, go back to social media and technology is that this idea of proximally absent parents. Where they're in the room together, but they're completely disconnected because everyone's sitting on their phone looking at social media. Or you see it in restaurants, whatever we used to be restaurants. Parents and a couple of kids, and everybody's sitting on their phone. Nobody's talking. Nobody's interacting with each other. And yeah, I mean, and obviously we're starting to see a lot of that stuff.
It's interesting times. The world is changing so quickly, and there's
Yeah,
lots of very strong opinions in each direction on what's right, what's wrong.
yeah, yeah.
Mm. What do you think? What do you think are some of the stereotypes that you mentioned that keep men from seeking help?
Uh, yeah. I mean, I think there's just a pervasive attitude that um, only people who are weak go to therapy. That certainly still exists, which seems to me now seems incredible.
Mhm.
Um, but it's definitely an attitude that is still out there. I think financial restraints impact on people coming to therapy as well. It can be seen very much as a luxury, um, both in emotional terms. I think as people can see it as indulgent, but also in financial terms. And it's one thing that I do notice. I think more with men that there is a tendency for men to come and have perhaps 3 or 4 sessions, get a little bit of relief, and think, okay, that's it, I'm gone. I'm out of here now. Where I certainly noticed that my female clients will tend to be more curious, and want to, once they start to see some movement, they're more interested to push on and learn more, and sort of go into a little bit more depth. And that's I'm making a very general statement there, but it's just something that I have versus female clients. I think for me, I think many men haven't experienced another man being compassionate towards them. I think that's a very unusual thing for many men in our society, and probably many women as well. Um, but certainly, a man being compassionate to another man, I can see the reaction sometimes for some of those men, that it's a very unusual thing. And I've noticed occasionally it can take a bit of time to almost, get past they just want to chat almost. They're kind of trying to be a bit macho, and they're trying to be a bit, tell macho jokes and this sort of stuff. And I'm just trying to be compassionate towards them, And it takes it's a really foreign thing. It seems like a really foreign idea to them that a man can be compassionate to another man, or maybe even a man can be compassionate at all. You know, so yeah, it's very interesting.
Hmm. How would you encourage men to be compassionate, or how would you get them to show that compassion to other men?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of it. I think there's a bit of it is modeling. For me as a therapist, where I just try and really be consistent with that compassion. Um, and I think, with that, that's also not about shying away from challenge, for instance, whenever challenge is appropriate. But I think that can also be done very compassionately. Um, but I mean, I would also speak to some clients specifically about being compassionate to others, about how they can show that to other people as a means of, you know, treating others as you would like them to treat you. Uh, because quite often people are bringing that stuff into the room and they're, well, you know, oh, my wife is doing this to me, or my partner's doing that to me, or she keeps saying this, or he keeps saying that. And I'm simply sometimes turning that around to say, okay, well, how do you speak to them? Maybe you could help them to understand how you'd like to be spoken to by you speaking to them in that way.
Hmm.
So, and you know, that's of course not to say that some relationships are not difficult and appropriate. That's not avoiding that stuff, but on very simple terms, just offering that idea of being compassionate to see that that opens the door for that to come back again.
Hmm. Right. So modeling what you sort of want to see, and then, probably feeling good about your own behavior, regardless of how someone acts towards you. Um,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
one thing, actually, as you mentioned, I was going to ask you, a lot of people they're not used to having compassion shown to them. They don't know how to take it.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering how you address that with a
Yeah.
person that, can't take compliments. They get uncomfortable when someone is being compassionate or validating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point, actually. So it is, and I think particularly, people who have been traumatized a lot of the time, and particularly, traumatized in childhood, perhaps through abuse of others, where actually, compassion could almost be perceived as grooming, because they may have experienced that in the past, and so certainly holding an awareness of that, and an awareness of how that is being perceived is important. And I think it's one of the challenges that I've noticed, certainly in moving to working online, where I don't have full access to the client's body, so I'm not able to track their body movements just as easily, in terms of trying to see their reactions to things, and trying to sort of be connected at that level with them. So I think there is no one size fits all. I think with all clients, I think I try to approach it as on an individual basis and see what feels right in terms of offering that compassion to each client, and see how they respond to that. And also, I think, using some psychoeducation around some of that stuff as well for some clients, that actually, it's okay to hear that you're a good person. It's okay to think that way. It's okay to actually think that about yourself. It's okay to acknowledge that what you did there was a good thing, and you did a good thing. Um, that is so foreign, I think, for many people, that certainly, again, you know, certainly from an Irish perspective, many of us grew up here with the kind of message that so anything in any way celebratory about an achievement would be seen as a boastful thing and therefore a bad thing. So, any sort of acknowledgement that an achievement, for instance, is a good thing has been suppressed. And so, many people with this idea that actually they can't celebrate hard work, they can't celebrate and acknowledge where they have achieved things. And simply, I think at times trying to sit with people and actually, help them to understand you worked really hard to achieve this thing. And that was really difficult. And you committed a lot of yourself to that. And you've achieved that. And that is amazing. For some people, again, seems a bit foreign to allow themselves to feel that.
Mm-hmm. It really is. I do notice that. Some people will get visibly, like you said, the body language is such a big giveaway. They'll get visibly uncomfortable if you say, wow, that what you just went through must have been devastating. And they just go, well, I mean, I've had it worse. Or, other people have it worse.
I think one of the things, I try to work on, and, is actually sitting, if I'm working with someone for a while and they come in to a session and they say, oh, I've had a good week, this happened and I was able to do, A, B, and C, and I felt good, and it was a bit tough, but I was able to work through it. And actually, it was really good. So actually spending time with that person, looking at that, and, sort of sitting in that experience so that it really kind of enhances how that felt for them to get something, to do, for something to go well for them, and for them to see that actually, the therapeutic process is working, that, and more importantly, that the work that they're putting in is working, that actually they're not doomed to live in this place of failure, for instance, that they believe that they're in. And so helping them to actually embody that and feel, right, okay, so that's what that feels like. That's what it feels okay. And it's okay. It's okay to say that then. I'm allowed to actually say and talk about this. So yeah, like it's such simple stuff, really. Mm-hmm. But it seems to mean a lot.
It does. It's wonderful that you're able to do that with people. I was just thinking about, just kind of going back to, your past career, and, we do treat veterans in our practice. We do work with, police officers from time to time. And I noticed that, I'm not sure if it's just sort of the culture, or even just the fact that you were in survival mode for years and years on end. But they have to sort of think about mental health issues in a way that doesn't let them sort of let it in, like if in your case, I'm curious, here you're working with cadaver dogs, you're finding human remains, you're seeing the result of suicide and murder. I mean, do you think about mental health issues differently now than you did then?
I mean, the team that I was in, there were 24 of us in that team that were very closely involved in those searches. And we were all very aware of the impact of it. And that was without conversation. I think we just knew. So there was a respect around that stuff. And maybe perhaps going against a little bit of, public perception at times, there wasn't a lot of black humor took place in relation to that. There was a respect about it. And the difficulty for what we were doing was that we were interacting with the families as well. So we were quite often interviewing the family of the victim and then being involved in the search and then perhaps finding the victim and recovering the person. And then quite often, perhaps sort of the family being there as the person's being recovered. And it humanized the whole thing because it made it a human experience. We didn't have that detachment. So we weren't able to treat it as, okay, well, this is a job, this is a search, we're doing this, and this is horrible, but we can't change this. We didn't have that separation. So the connection between the family and the trauma made the whole thing much worse. And for me, whenever I was coming close to the end, like I was in therapy for 2 years before I eventually was retired. When I went there, I talked for 6 months about that work. Alone, that was the only thing that I talked about. And yet I had been searching for bombs for, really for the previous period of time in a very high threat environment. And I didn't speak about that at all because I didn't actually see that as traumatic because it was only me. So I was quite happy to accept the threat to my life, but it was the threat to this other stuff, this human loss and seeing. And again, it's relevant in terms of vicarious trauma for us as therapists, I think. It was witnessing the pain of these families, which probably really did a significant amount of damage for me, if that makes sense.
Well, it's certainly much harder to disconnect yourself and like you said, to engage in the Black humor, which is a form of coping when
Yeah.
you see the impact and you can see
Yeah.
what happens here. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there was support within the police service here. However, it had to be sought out. So there was no sort of preemptive dealing with anything. There was no systematic way of trying to take care of people so that trauma didn't happen.
Right.
So really, by the time most people in the police in Northern Ireland go seeking for help, the damage is done at that point. They've reached a point where really they're at collapse and they can't go on. So there wasn't a real awareness combined with a willingness to do something about it along the way. And a lot of that comes down to money, I think, a lot of that down to the cost involved in it. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the studies do show that if there's a debriefing, especially with a professional within 48 hours of an incident like that, the chances of people going on to develop PTSD is very much reduced. But I think perhaps budget-wise, the idea of people being, going off and being retired because of PTSD, it's too abstract. It's not right now. So it's hard to account for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Given your experience now, your experience as a police officer, your own experience with PTSD, and now working in mental health, what do you think are the most protective factors for keeping a person from committing suicide?
I would say definitely speaking to other people. And it's one of the reasons why what we're experiencing at the minute with COVID, I think, is so difficult. The isolation that's being created for people, combined with this ongoing trauma that we're living in. Because let's face it, we're surrounded by the threat of death. Combine that with the isolation that we're being forced into, which of course creates space for people to sit in their houses and, look at 24-hour news and ruminate over the danger involved in that is really just a recipe for trauma. And so I definitely think, being able to speak to others is key. For me, being outdoors is a massive factor, regardless of what the weather's doing. It rains here a lot in Ireland, I'm sure you know that. So it doesn't matter what it's doing here for me. I try to be outdoors every day. I try to be as honest as I can be about how I'm feeling with people that I trust, people who are close to me, and definitely seeking help, seeking out professional help. If someone thinks there's a problem, there's a problem. If they think there might be difficulty from a situation, go and seek out help. Don't wait. You don't have to wait until it's completely gone. I mean, I first saw, I was first diagnosed with PTSD in 2001, but I continued to be able to operate in my job, through taking care of myself, through, doing a number of things. Yoga was very, very helpful for me in terms of, my PTSD. I had a community of people that I was very close to, that I was able to be very honest with those people. Therapy was incredibly helpful. Cutting out the booze was, vital for me. Watching what I eat has a massive impact on my mental health. Exercise has a massive impact on my mental health. Right now with COVID, not exposing myself to a lot of news is a major thing. Personally, I find news is just the devil, quite frankly. Like it's just terrible. And so, I might watch 5 minutes of headlines, if that. Honestly, there's nothing going on in the world that really needs my input. And so, I avoid that stuff. Social media, I dip in and out of it. I think it can be incredibly destructive and addictive. And so trying to keep that stuff in perspective and seek out stuff that is good for me. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to, a lot of stuff that feeds me, tapping into people who are interested in developing themselves and bettering themselves. And I don't mean from a financial perspective or from a business perspective. I mean, from a personal perspective, from a well-being perspective. And there's a wealth of that stuff out there, an absolute wealth. I mean, you're doing it. You're doing it. And I think this is an amazing medium for people. So I think it's absolutely fantastic.
I personally, I agree, because I have learned so much from podcasts. Had my mind opened, and whenever I want to learn about any subject, it's endless. The resources I can find, and if I can't find them, well, then let's go create some. So
yeah.
Yeah, but I so much appreciate your perspective and your story. It's incredible what you've been through, and just it's so cool to be able to talk to you all the way over in Ireland. And yeah. So where can people find out a little bit more about you if they wanted to look you up?
Yeah, well, back to the social media thing. I am on Instagram, and it's the email address of my business. It's counselling therapy Belfast @gmail.com. And counselling over here in the UK is spelled with 2 L's, not the American spelling of 1 L, and that's all one word. Counselling therapy Belfast @gmail.com.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.